The morning Ruth Ann Garrett walked into the Hardin County livestock auction. She was still wearing the black dress from her husband's burial. Nobody mentioned it, not because they didn't notice, but because nobody in a small Ohio farm town in the spring of 1974 knew what to say to a 34-year-old widow who showed up at a livestock sale 7 days after putting her husband in the ground. Most people gave her a wide berth the way you give wide berth to a dog that's been hurt badly enough that you're not sure which way it'll go. You don't know if it'll let you near or take your hand off at the wrist. Ruth didn't look hurt. That was the thing that unsettled people most. She walked in with the same expression she'd worn since the morning they found her husband Thomas face down in the south field, his body half under the PTO shaft of the old baler he'd been trying to fix alone. That expression was not grief and it was not numbness. It was something harder to name. It was the face of a woman who had already moved to the next thing, while everyone around her was still trying to absorb the last one. She took a program from the table by the door, found a seat in the middle of the third row, and sat with her hands folded in her lap, while cattle moved through the ring and men in seed caps called out numbers in that flat, economic language that farm auctions always use, a language where nothing has a name, only a price. The geese came through at 11:40 in the morning. 280 Toulouse geese and 40 runner ducks, penned together in a wood and wire crate so large it took 4 men to carry it. The auctioneer read from his card without much enthusiasm, because geese are not cattle, and this was cattle country, and most of the men in that room had no particular interest in waterfowl. The opening bid was $40. Ruth raised her hand. A man named Dale Prout, sitting 2 rows back, leaned over to the man beside him and said something low that made both of them smile. The bidding moved in small jumps the way it does when nobody really wants a thing, and they're only raising the price out of mild curiosity or a vague sense that maybe they should want it. It got to $68 and stopped. Ruth raised her hand one more time. $74. The auctioneer looked around the room with his gavel held up, and when nobody moved, he brought it down. Ruth signed the receipt, paid in cash from an envelope she'd brought in her coat pocket, and arranged for the crate to be loaded into the bed of her pickup. She was back on the road to the Garrett farm by noon. The man who'd sold her the paperwork watched her truck pull out of the lot and then looked at the receipt in his hand for a moment before filing it away. 280 Toulouse geese and 40 runner ducks. Cash. 7 days after her husband's funeral. By suppertime, the story had made its way to the Main Street Diner, which in Hardin County served the same function that newspapers serve in larger places. Dale Prout told it at the counter over coffee and pie, and he told it with the affectionate contempt that small towns reserve for people who do things that don't make sense. He used the words poor woman more than once. He shook his head in a way that communicated both pity and satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who has always believed that grief makes people do foolish things, and here was fresh evidence for his position. Nobody at the counter disagreed. Most of them just looked into their cups. There was one man who said nothing at all. Earl Doss was 70 years old and he had lived on the property that bordered the Garrett farm to the north for his entire adult life. He had known Thomas Garrett since Thomas was a boy. He had watched the Garrett land for decades in the way that old farmers watch land, which is to say carefully, without much commentary, the way you watch weather. When Dale Prout finished his story, Earl put some coins on the counter and walked out into the evening without saying a word. Nobody thought much about that either. What Ruth Garrett was doing, nobody in Hardin County understood yet. But Earl Doss was one of those rare people who understood that not understanding something is not the same as it being wrong. He walked home along the fence line that separated his property from the Garrett place, and he looked south toward the low ground that sat at the western edge of the Garrett farm. The 42 acres that the county had tried 3 times to fix and failed every time. And he thought about things that were not quite formed enough to be called thoughts yet. More like a feeling of recognition you get when someone starts a sentence that you've been waiting a long time to hear completed. That low ground had a name among the older families of the county. They called it the Hollow. The Hollow was not a hollow in any geographic sense. It was a broad, flat depression of approximately 42 acres in the western corner of the Garrett property, and it had been saturated with standing water for as long as anyone in the county could remember. Not because of a high water table, not because of seasonal flooding in the usual sense, but because of something in the geology of that particular patch of earth that the agricultural engineers who eventually examined it would describe as an anomalous impermeable clay stratum, sitting approximately 18 inches below the topsoil. A shelf of dense, almost ceramic earth that water could not pass through, and that conventional drainage could not easily defeat. Thomas Garrett's father had tried to beat it in 1955. He'd rented a backhoe and hired 2 men and spent 3 weeks digging drainage channels along the north edge of the hollow. On the 22nd day, the backhoe sank to its axles in a particularly soft section, and they spent 2 more days getting it out, and then they quit. The channels they dug filled with water within a week of the next rain, and nothing was changed. In 1961, the county sent a man named Al Bigelow out to take a look. Bigelow was a practical, experienced engineer who had drained a lot of Ohio farmland in his career, and he approached the hollow with confidence and a survey instrument and a clipboard. He spent 6 weeks on the project, tried 2 different approaches to tiling and drainage, and wrote a report at the end of it that said the land presented unusual technical challenges and that further study might be warranted. The county did not fund further study. The report went into a filing cabinet and stayed there. The third attempt came in 1968. Tom Ellery was 32 years old and newly appointed as Hardin County's chief agricultural engineer, and he had the particular energy of a man who has recently been given authority and wants to demonstrate that it was deserved. He assembled a proper team, brought in better equipment, spent 11 weeks on the hollow with systematic determination, and spent $18,000 of county money in the process. He tried deep tiling. He tried interceptor drains along the east slope. He tried a pump system that he was fairly confident would work. None of it worked. The clay stratum defeated everything he brought against it. The report Tom Ellery filed in November of 1968 was brief and final. It read, in the relevant section, land classified as non-recoverable. Drainage efforts terminated. Recommendation: no further county resources to be allocated to this parcel. He signed it and filed it and tried not to think about it much, which was easy for a while and then got easier as years passed, and other problems filled up the space where that failure had been. The hollow sat. Water covered most of it through the wet months. In dry summers, a person could walk around the edges of it without getting their boots too wet, but the center stayed damp and soft and useless, and the soil that surrounded it on the Garrett side was darker and richer in the places where the water spread out in wet years, and then retreated, depositing organic material that made the grass grow high and green, but didn't make the ground any more useful for crops because the drainage problem was always there, always waiting, always winning. Thomas Garrett had grown up with the hollow as a fact of his inheritance, the same way some families inherit debt or bad luck or a distant relative nobody likes to talk about. He didn't hate it. He didn't think much about it. It was just there on the western edge of the farm, taking up 42 acres that couldn't be planted and couldn't be sold for anything worth selling for, classified non-recoverable by the county, and that was the end of the story. Or it should have been. Ruth Garrett had come to the farm as a bride in 1969, 29 years old. the daughter of a man who had farmed 60 acres of marginal ground in Morgan County, with the kind of meticulous, patient attention that poor ground demands and rich ground never teaches. Her father had not been a man of many words, but he had been a man of deep observation, and growing up in his house had meant growing up in the habit of watching things carefully, and for a long time before drawing any conclusions. In the first weeks after she moved to the Garrett farm, Ruth had walked every acre of it in the methodical way her father had taught her. She had walked the hollow last, on a cold afternoon in late November, and she had stood at its edge for a long time looking at the water that sat still and dark in the center of it, at the grass that grew high and green around its margins, at the particular texture of the soil where the wet ground met the dry. She noticed on that first visit that there were geese, wild Canada geese, a small flock, feeding at the eastern margin of the hollow with their heads down and their bodies moving in that unhurried, deliberate way that geese have when they are comfortable. They were not passing through. They were settled. They were at home. Ruth had stood and watched them for a while and then walked back to the farmhouse for supper. She didn't mention the geese to Thomas. There was nothing to say about them yet. What she did that winter was go looking for the storage room off the main barn where Thomas kept his father's things. It took her an afternoon to find what she was looking for, inside a wooden crate underneath a canvas tarp, inside a metal biscuit tin that had gone rusty at the seams. The tin held a small notebook, its cover warped and softened with age, its pages filled with the cramped, careful handwriting of a man who had spent decades watching things and writing down what he saw. Harlan Garrett's notebook, Thomas's father, dead since 1962. Ruth sat on an overturned bucket in the cold storage room and read every page of it. Harlan had been keeping notes on the hollow since 1941. 20 years of observation, from the year Thomas was born until the year Harlan died, in the careful, plain language of a man with an 8th-grade education who was nonetheless paying closer attention to his land than most agricultural scientists paid to their research plots. He recorded water levels by season, the condition of the soil at the margins, what grew and what didn't, where the wild things came and went. Most significantly, he had been recording the geese. Not the same flock every year, but geese that returned to the hollow on a reliable seasonal schedule, stopping in migration, and sometimes staying through the winter in the wet years when the hollow stayed open. Harlan had noted that in the years when geese spent the most time on the hollow, the grass at the eastern margin was visibly more robust the following spring. He had noted that over the years a particular section of the eastern edge seemed to be slowly changing, the soil becoming darker, the vegetation thicker and more diverse. He had written in 1957, "The east edge is firming up some. Can't say why." He had written in 1960, "Dry summer but the east section came back faster than anywhere else on the place. Something is different there." And on the very last page, in handwriting that was shakier than the earlier entries, probably written in the last year of his life, Harlan Garrett had written, "The geese know something about this ground that I don't. I'll keep watching." He didn't get the chance to keep watching. Ruth had read the notebook through twice that afternoon and then put it back in the tin and put the tin under the crate and pulled the tarp back over everything. She went back to the house and started making supper and didn't say anything to Thomas about it, not that evening, not ever. Not because it was a secret, because there wasn't anything to say yet. She was still thinking. She thought about it for 5 years. She thought about it while learning the rhythms of the farm, while getting to know the character of the land, while watching the hollow through 4 full seasons, and then 4 more and then 4 more after that. She read everything she could find about wetland ecology, about soil biology, about the chemistry of decomposition, and the way organic material builds up in saturated soils over time. She drove to the county library in Kenton twice a month, and sat in the reference section with agricultural journals and extension service publications, reading the way a person reads when they are looking for confirmation of something they already more than half believe. What she was building toward was not a theory, it was a plan, and the plan required geese. There is a particular kind of intelligence that does not announce itself, that moves quietly through the world without certificates or titles, that accumulates knowledge the way soil accumulates organic matter, slowly, invisibly, over years, until one day the ground is different from what it was, and you can no longer point to the moment it changed. Ruth Garrett had that kind of intelligence. She had gotten it from her father, who could look at a stand of corn in July and tell you things about the November harvest that no soil test would have shown you, who understood the particular language that struggling land speaks if you are patient enough to listen to it, who had spent a lifetime in conversation with 40 acres of difficult ground and had made a life from it that was modest but whole. Ruth had watched her father the way children watch parents they are quietly trying to understand. She had never wanted to be a farmer in the way that some farm children grow up burning for it. What she had wanted, without having words for it when she was young, was the quality of attention she saw in her father when he walked his fields. He never moved quickly over his own ground. He stooped and picked things up. He rubbed soil between his fingers and held it to his nose. He watched the sky and the drainage channels and the color of the leaves with the focused calm of a man, engaged in a conversation that he found genuinely interesting. When she married Thomas Garrett and moved to the farm in Hardin County, she brought that habit of attention with her like a piece of furniture that had always been in every room she'd ever lived in. She applied it to the Garrett land with the systematic patience of someone who believes that land always tells you the truth if you ask it the right questions over a long enough time. The 5 years between the first time she read Harlan Garrett's notebook and the morning she drove to the livestock auction were not idle years. She was reading constantly and watching constantly and testing ideas in her head against what she observed in the hollow through every season. She noted the way the eastern margin recovered faster after dry summers. She noted which wild plants grew at the water's edge and what their presence suggested about soil chemistry. She noted the years when the wild geese stayed longer and the years they passed through quickly, and she began to believe she understood the difference, that in the years the geese lingered the soil at the margin was marginally more active the following spring. None of this was proof of anything. She knew that. A woman with an 8th grade education and a habit of reading agricultural extension bulletins cannot prove a hypothesis about wetland bioremediation through observation alone. But she was not looking for proof in the scientific sense. She was looking for enough confidence to act. And by the spring of 1974, she had it. The death of Thomas had changed one thing about the timeline, and only one thing. It had moved the moment of action forward. With Thomas alive, she had been thinking about approaching the hollow gradually, adding geese to the wild population incrementally, letting the experiment develop at a pace that would not create financial risk to the farm. Without Thomas, with the debt and the pressure of Ray's legal interest and the farm's need for her to be right about something and right about it within a reasonable period of time, she had to commit fully and immediately. She had done the math in her head on the afternoon of the funeral, sitting in the farmhouse, while people she barely knew filled her kitchen with food and condolences. She had calculated how many birds she needed to make a meaningful biological impact on the hollow within the 5-year window she was going to ask Ray to give her. She had thought about the capital she had available, the cash Thomas kept in the household account for operating expenses, the money in her own small savings account that she had maintained separately since before the marriage. She had arrived at a number and a budget and a plan. $74 for 320 birds. It was, when she thought about it calmly, a reasonable bet. The morning they found Thomas, Ruth had been reading a 1958 paper from Purdue University about the relationship between waterfowl populations and natural wetland soil chemistry. She had put the paper face down on the kitchen table when the men came to the door. It was still there, face down, when she got back from the county coroner's office that afternoon. She didn't pick it up for 3 days. Then she picked it up and finished reading it, and set it on top of a growing stack of papers she kept in the bottom drawer of the desk in the small office off the kitchen where Thomas had done the farm's bookkeeping. When the numbness of the first week lifted enough that Ruth could think in straight lines again, the thing she found herself thinking about was the auction. The livestock auction was the coming Thursday. She had checked the listing in the county paper, and there were geese on it. That was how she came to be sitting in the third row of the Hardin County livestock barn in a black funeral dress on a Thursday in April of 1974, with $74 cash in an envelope in her coat pocket. The week after the auction, Ray Garrett came. Ray was Thomas's older brother, 52 years old, a heavy-set man with Thomas's same square jaw and none of Thomas's patience. He worked in insurance in Toledo and came back to Hardin County 3 or 4 times a year for holidays and obligatory visits, and he had always had the slightly impatient energy of a man who had left a place and was quietly proud of it. He had been at the funeral. He had stayed through the reception at the farmhouse, eaten potato salad in the kitchen with the other men, said the things you say, and driven back to Toledo the same evening. Now he was back, and he had a folder of papers under his arm. He sat across from Ruth at the kitchen table and spread the papers out in front of her with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who wants to be taken seriously and has rehearsed this moment. Thomas's will, which Ray had obtained from the county records office, established that Ray held a 20% interest in the appraised value of the farm property as a condition of the original transfer from their father's estate. This was, Ray explained, not a claim against Ruth's ownership of the farm itself. It was more of a financial interest, a contingent value that would be realized if and when the farm was sold. What Ray was proposing was a sale. He had already, he said, spoken to a real estate agent out of Lima who specialized in agricultural properties. There was interest in the market. The main farm ground, 238 acres of decent to good cropland, would sell for somewhere between $800 and $1,000 an acre. The 42 acres of the hollow would move for maybe $200 an acre if they were lucky, though that was probably optimistic given the county's classification of it. The farm buildings and the house would add something. All told, Ray estimated they were looking at a sale value somewhere north of $200,000. Ruth's share, after paying off the $23,000 in equipment debt Thomas had taken on the previous year for the new grain combine, would be somewhere in the range of $150,000. Enough to buy a smaller, more manageable property. Enough to start over. He said all of this in the tone of a man who believes he is delivering good news. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at Ruth across the papers and waited. Ruth looked at the papers. She was quiet for long enough that Ray shifted in his chair. Then she said, "Give me 5 years, Ray. If I'm wrong, I'll sign whatever you want." Ray looked at her the way a man looks at something he can't quite classify. Not angry, not dismissive, more the expression you get when you've prepared a long argument and the other person said something so brief that you're not sure the argument applies anymore. He said, "Ruth, you're talking about running 280 acres alone." She said, "And 40 geese." It took him a moment to understand she was not joking, and another moment after that to decide what to do with a person who responds to a business proposal with a reference to waterfowl. What Ray Garrett decided in the end was that he did not have the heart to push harder. Not yet. Not this soon after the burial. He told himself he was being kind. He was also, if he was honest about it, slightly unnerved by something in Ruth's manner that he could not name, a quality of stillness and certainty that made him feel, obscurely, that he was the one who didn't understand the situation rather than her. He said he would give her time to think about it. She said she'd appreciate that. He gathered his papers and put them back in the folder, and she poured him more coffee, and they talked about small things for another hour. And when he left, she stood on the porch and watched his car until it was out of sight. Then she went to the barn to check on the geese. She had penned them in the main barn initially while she worked out the logistics of getting them down to the hollow. It was not a simple matter. The hollow's western edge was accessible by a farm track, but the track was in poor repair, and in spring, the approach to the low ground was soft enough to make driving down it uncertain. She needed temporary fencing to define a perimeter that would keep the geese working the hollow without them spreading over the whole farm. She needed to think about water access and predator management, and the particular vulnerabilities of domestic geese, introduced to a wetland environment that she knew from reading, was not without its hazards. She spent 4 days on the logistics, and then she moved the geese. It was a rainy Tuesday morning in late April when she walked the flock down the farm track to the hollow, moving them slowly with a long stick the way her father had moved his chickens, with patience rather than urgency. The geese were nervous and loud in the gray rain, and the track was soft, and Ruth's boots were covered in mud by the time she got them through the wire gate she had strung between 2 fence posts at the hollow's edge. She stood outside the wire and watched them for a while. They spread out across the edge of the hollow, tentative at first, testing the ground with their feet, tasting the water, looking around with the alert, ancient-eyed skepticism that geese always wear. Then one of the big Toulouse ganders walked forward into the standing water at the center of the hollow without any hesitation at all, as if he had been here before, as if this was simply the place he had been going, and the others followed him in. Earl Doss was standing at his fence line to the north, a quarter-mile away, watching. Ruth didn't wave. She turned and walked back up the track to the farm. 3 weeks after the geese went into the hollow, Clint Bowman drove up to the Garrett farmhouse in a black Cadillac DeVille that was clean enough that you could see the sky in its hood. Clint Bowman owned 1,800 acres in Hardin County, made it 2,200 if you counted the parcels over in Wyandotte that people around here tended to forget about when they were estimating what Bowman had. He ran 4 John Deere combines during harvest and employed 7 men full-time, and was the kind of man who sat on the county agricultural committee, not because anyone had asked him to, but because it had never occurred to him that there were rooms in Hardin County he was not entitled to walk into. He was not a bad man. That is worth saying clearly, because small-town powerful men in stories like this are often made into cartoons of meanness, and Bowman was not that. He was a man who had won most of his confrontations with land and weather and markets through a combination of scale, capital, and a genuine instinct for agriculture, and who had therefore arrived at the not unreasonable conclusion that his way of doing things was probably the right way. He had made Ruth's husband an offer on the hollow 3 times over the years, not because he wanted it, because he didn't want someone else to figure out something about it that he hadn't figured out first. The price he offered was always low enough to make clear that he didn't think much of the land's prospects, but he made the offer regularly because that was how Bowman operated. He kept his options in front of him. He knocked on the door and Ruth opened it, and he took his hat off and said he'd heard about Thomas and he was sorry, which was probably true, and then he said he'd been thinking, and he wanted to make her an offer on that low ground out west. He named a price, $1,200 for all 42 acres, and then he said, which was the serious part of the offer, that he would clear the outstanding equipment debt, the $23,000, as part of the transaction. He said it in the way men like Bowman say things when they believe they are being generous, which is with the faint emphasis of someone who wants to be sure you understand the size of the gift you're being given. Ruth listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then she said, "No thank you, Mr. Bowman." Bowman had not been told no very often, and he had the particular look of a man rearranging his face after an unexpected impact. He kept the rearrangement polite. He said he understood she had a lot on her mind, and she should take her time and think about it, and he'd be in no rush. Ruth said she had thought about it. Bowman put his hat back on and turned to go, and then stopped and looked back at the pens, where the geese were visible through the barn door. 280 of them making the low, continuous sound that large flocks of domestic geese make when they are not alarmed, a sound like a distant conversation. He said, "Those birds are gonna eat your last dollar, Mrs. Garrett. You call me when you're ready." Ruth did not respond. She watched him walk to his car. She watched the Cadillac go down the farm road and turn onto the county road and disappear behind the tree line. Then she went inside and wrote in a small spiral notebook she kept on the kitchen windowsill, "Bowman, April 1974, offered to clear the debt. He knows something or he suspects something. Watch what he does next." She put the notebook in the kitchen drawer and thought about what it meant that Clint Bowman was willing to clear $23,000 in debt to get his hands on 42 acres that the county had classified as worthless. The summer of 1974 was a hard one. Ruth had known going in that the first season would be difficult. She had read enough about wetland environments and domestic waterfowl management to know that introducing birds to a saturated, long stagnant water body carried real risks. What she had not fully anticipated was the particular parasite that had been sitting dormant in the hollow's sediment, waiting for exactly the warm, concentrated biological activity that 320 birds provided. By mid-June, she had lost 40 geese. By mid-July, the number was 87. It was not a quick death. It was the slow, dispiriting death of birds that stop eating, that separate themselves from the flock, that stand still where healthy geese are always in motion. Ruth checked them every morning and every evening, and she kept records of every loss, and she did not allow herself the luxury of panic. But there were mornings that summer when she stood at the wire looking at the hollow and the sick birds, and felt the weight of what she had put in motion pressing down on her in a way that made it hard to breathe. Ray called in late July. He had heard from someone in the county that she was losing birds. He asked her in a careful, almost gentle voice whether she wanted to talk to someone about the farm's situation. She understood what he was asking. He was asking whether she was ready to quit. She said she was fine and she would talk to him in the fall. She hung up the telephone and drove 40 miles to the county library in Kenton and spent 6 hours in the agricultural reference section. What she found, in a 1958 Extension Service bulletin from Purdue University, was a description of a waterfowl parasite that matched exactly what she was seeing in her flock. The bulletin described the parasite's life cycle, its relationship to stagnant freshwater environments, its particular prevalence in ground that had been waterlogged for extended periods without significant biological activity. And in the last section, where most agricultural publications of that era would have recommended a veterinary pharmaceutical intervention that Ruth could not have afforded, this particular bulletin described an alternative approach documented among rural poultry keepers in southern Indiana. A combination of crushed garlic and fine-ground bran added to the bird's feed over a period of 3 weeks, which disrupted the parasite's reproduction cycle without the expense of medication. Ruth drove home, stopped at the feed store, bought bran and garlic in the quantities she needed, and started the treatment that evening. 6 weeks later, she had lost no more birds. The survivors were healthy, alert, active, and moving across the hollow with the confidence of birds that had won something. She had 193 geese left and 40 intact runner ducks. She had lost more than a third of what she'd paid for. She had spent the summer without income from the hollow, and with the grain harvest on the main farm only marginally profitable in that particular market year. Dale Prout came into the Main Street diner in late September and told anyone who would listen that the Garrett widow had lost half her bird flock, and it was only a matter of time now. He shook his head with the head shaking of a man whose predictions are coming true, and who finds this satisfying even when the prediction was a loss for someone else. Earl Doss sat at the counter and drank his coffee. That same week, Ruth went back to the storage room in the barn and got the biscuit tin and sat on the overturned bucket in the cold fall light and opened the notebook to the last page again. She read the last line again, the way she had read it a dozen times since she'd first found the notebook. The geese know something about this ground that I don't. I'll keep watching. And below that, so small she had not noticed it the first 3 times she read the page, almost pressed into the margin, in pencil so light it was nearly invisible. Year 3 is when the ground starts to listen. She sat with that for a long time in the cold storage room. Year 3. She was in year 1. She had lost 87 birds and the ground had given her nothing yet. She was 2 years from the moment Harlan Garrett had believed mattered, written by a man who never got to see it, whose son had never known enough to look for it, whose daughter-in-law had found it in a rusted tin under a canvas tarp on a cold November afternoon, and had spent 5 years turning it over in her mind before she decided it was worth betting on. She put the notebook back in the tin. She put the tin in her coat pocket and carried it back to the farmhouse. She put it in the bottom drawer of the desk where she kept her papers and her Purdue bulletins and her agricultural journals. She went to the kitchen and started making supper. Outside, the 193 geese that had survived the summer moved across the edge of the hollow in the long evening light, feeding in the grass at the margins, going in and out of the water, leaving behind them the invisible, patient chemistry that was the only thing in the world that Harlan Garrett had believed could change that ground. Ruth did not know yet whether he was right, but she was a woman who had grown up watching her father make something out of nothing on 60 acres of marginal ground through attention and patience, and a refusal to be discouraged by what the land was rather than what it might become. She had 2 more years. The clock was running, and she was not done. The second year was quieter than the first, not easier but quieter. Ruth had learned something important from the summer of the dying birds, something that could not be found in any extension service bulletin or agricultural journal, something that you can only learn by standing at the edge of a wire fence in the early morning watching sick geese with your hands at your sides and nothing left to do but wait. She had learned the difference between panic and patience, which sounds like a simple thing until you have actually needed to know it. Panic is what the situation asks of you. Patience is what you choose instead. The choice is not made once. It is made every morning, and some mornings it costs more than others. Spring of 1975 came late to Hardin County, the way Ohio springs sometimes do, teasing and withdrawing, warmth for 4 days, and then a week of cold rain and then warmth again. The kind of weather that makes farmers keep their boots by the door and their coats on the hook within easy reach. Ruth managed the surviving flock through the uncertain weeks with the careful attention of someone who has already paid tuition for her mistakes and has no intention of paying it twice. She adjusted feed quantities according to the temperature. She checked the wire fencing along the hollow's perimeter twice a week, patching the soft spots in the ground where fence posts worked loose in the freeze and thaw. She watched the birds the way her father had watched his fields, with the particular quality of attention that is not worry, but is close enough to worry that other people sometimes could not tell the difference. What she was watching for in those early months of the second year was any sign at all that Harlan Garrett's belief was more than an old man's wishful thinking. What she was watching for was change. The eastern margin of the hollow was where she focused her attention. Harlan had written about it specifically, had noted its different character across years of observation. It was the area closest to Earl Doss's fence line to the north, a stretch of perhaps 60 yards where the standing water gave way to saturated soil, and then to wet grass, and then to the transition zone where the drainage from the main farm ground began. The soil there was darker than the soil in the center of the hollow. It had been accumulating whatever the geese brought to it, and what the geese brought to it was biological activity of a kind that particular patch of earth had not had in the decades it had sat under institutional abandonment. Ruth walked the eastern margin on a Tuesday morning in late May of 1975, and she crouched down and pressed her fingers into the soil at the edge of the standing water, and she felt something she had not felt there the previous spring. The soil was denser. Not dry, not dramatically changed, but denser in the way that soil becomes when its structure is improving from the inside, when the invisible architecture of it is being rebuilt by organisms too small to see and processes too slow to watch directly. She pressed deeper and found a resistance that had not been there before, a coherence. She did not tell anyone. She stood up, wiped her hand on her jeans, and walked back to the farmhouse to start the day's work. Earl Doss saw her crouching at the eastern margin that morning. He was at his fence line the way he was most mornings, drinking coffee from a thermos, watching his own land and adjacent lands with the habitual alertness of a man who has lived his whole life in the same quarter section and understands that paying attention to land is not a task but a practice, something you do every day the way you eat and sleep, because stopping means losing something you cannot get back. He watched Ruth crouch, press her fingers into the soil, stand, and walk away. He looked at the spot where she had been crouching for a while after she left. Then he poured the last of his coffee onto the ground and walked back to his own barn. The summer of 1975 was uneventful by the standards of what had come before and what would come later. The geese were healthy. Ruth brought in a reasonable corn harvest from the main farm ground, managed the equipment debt payment to the bank, and began to build back a small operating reserve in the household account. She sold eggs from the farm chickens and goose eggs from the flock at the hollow, which were not a significant income but were steady. And in farming, steady is worth more than its weight because steady is rare. In the fall, she walked the eastern margin again, and the soil was different still. 8 acres of it along the edge were draining in a way that was not dramatic but was measurable, the kind of change that a soil scientist would have recorded carefully, and a farmer would have felt in the boots, a slight firmness underfoot where before there had been give. She looked at the 8 acres and then looked at the center of the hollow where the water still stood dark and flat, and the willow grass grew thick at its edges, and the geese moved across it in their long, loose formations. And she thought about year 3, which was coming, which Harlan had believed was the year the ground starts to listen. She was not a superstitious woman. She did not attach mystical significance to the words of a dead man she had never met. But she had learned, by that point, that patient observation over long periods sometimes produces insights that look like intuition from the outside, and that what Harlan had been describing was probably not prophecy, but pattern, the pattern of soil biology moving at the speed soil biology moves, which is a speed that has no relationship to the urgency of the people standing above it waiting for results. Year 3 came. It was 1977, and the ground started to listen. What that meant in practical terms was this: 22 of the 42 acres of the hollow were in some stage of active biological recovery by the end of the third growing season. Not farmable yet, not even close to farmable, but changed in ways that a person who knew what to look for could see and measure. The clay stratum below had not been broken, which Tom Ellery's expensive equipment had also failed to break, but something more interesting was happening above it. The organic matter accumulating from 3 years of concentrated goose activity was creating a biologically active layer of topsoil above the clay that was beginning, very slowly, to develop its own drainage characteristics. Water that had once sat still was beginning to move, not through the clay, but through the organic layer above it, seeping laterally toward the hollow's edges through channels created by root systems and earthworm activity and the chemistry of decomposition. The ground was not being drained by machines. It was draining itself. Earl Doss was standing at his fence line the morning Ruth first walked the newly firm eastern section without her boots sinking, without the characteristic lurch and suck of saturated ground. He watched her walk it in a straight line from north to south, about 100 paces, not hurrying. When she reached the south end, she stopped and stood still for a moment. Then she turned and walked it back north. Earl poured the last of his coffee onto the grass. He looked at the hollow for a long time. Then he said to no one in particular, in a voice just above a whisper, the words that Ruth would not hear for another 14 years, when he finally told her what he had been watching all this time. There it is. It was also in the fall of 1977 that Ruth became certain Clint Bowman was having her watched. She had noticed the man twice before, a nondescript man in a brown jacket who had come up the county road on different pretexts, once to ask about a dog that he said had gotten loose, once to inquire about whether she had any hay to sell. Both times she had answered politely, and both times she had watched him from the kitchen window as he drove away and noted the direction he went, which was always south toward the Bowman operation on Route 31. The third time she saw him, he made no pretense at all, just drove slowly past the farm road entrance looking at the hollow from the road, and Ruth recognized him from the county fair 2 years prior as Jimmy Cress, Clint Bowman's wife's cousin, who did some kind of land work out of a small office in Kenton. She called Earl Doss that evening. Earl confirmed it without hesitation. Yes, he knew Jimmy Cress. Yes, Jimmy Cress was connected to the Bowman operation. He said it in the flat, unsurprised way of a man who has watched powerful people in a small county for 7 decades and finds none of their behavior particularly surprising anymore. Ruth thanked him and hung up. Then she sat at the kitchen table for a while thinking about what it meant that Clint Bowman was paying attention to the hollow after 3 years. Bowman was not a foolish man. He did not spend money watching things that were not worth watching. His interest was not confirmation of what Ruth already believed, because she did not need Bowman's interest to believe in what she was doing. But it was something else. It was information. She went to the desk in the office and found the small spiral notebook where she had written 3 years ago, Bowman, April 1974, offered to clear the debt. He knows something or he suspects something. Watch what he does next. She wrote underneath that entry, he is watching. Fall 1977. He can see the east margin from the road. He knows something is happening. He does not know yet what it means. Then she closed the notebook, put it in the drawer, and did something she had been thinking about for a long time. She drove to Columbus. The federal agriculture offices in Columbus were not easy to navigate if you did not know what you were looking for, and Ruth had spent 3 months figuring out what she was looking for before she made the trip. She had written letters, received written responses, read the responses carefully, written follow-up letters, and built up over that time a clear picture of a program that most small farm operators in Ohio had never heard of. The federal wetland conservation easement program was not widely publicized. It was not, in 1977, a program that the County Extension Service promoted or that the Farm Bureau discussed at its quarterly meetings. It was a federal instrument, administered through the Department of Agriculture, that allowed private landowners to voluntarily register wetland parcels under a permanent conservation easement in exchange for an annual payment and federal protections that superseded local and county authority. The annual payment was modest. For 42 acres of classified wetland in Ohio, the figure worked out to approximately $1,800 per year. Not a fortune, but the protections that came with it were, to Ruth's mind, worth far more than the payment. Under a federal conservation easement, no county engineering project, no local drainage scheme, no eminent domain claim could legally alter the registered wetland without a federal waiver that would take years to obtain and would almost certainly not be granted for a parcel that had been deliberately registered and maintained. Clint Bowman could not buy what the federal government was protecting. The county could not drain what the federal government had designated as protected wetland, and no one in Hardin County had any reason to look for this particular layer of protection on a piece of ground that the county itself had classified as worthless. Ruth drove to Columbus on a Wednesday in November of 1977 and sat in a waiting room for 2 hours, and then spent 45 minutes with a federal lands officer named Patricia Webb, who was professional and efficient, and who looked at Ruth's documentation with the careful thoroughness that federal bureaucrats bring to paperwork that might become permanent. Patricia Webb said the application looked complete. She said the review process would take several months. She said Ruth would hear by mail. Ruth drove home in the dark, 3 hours on 2-lane Ohio roads, and did not tell anyone where she had been. The confirmation letter arrived in March of 1978. She put it in the biscuit tin with Harlan's notebook. She did not mention it to Ray, who called periodically to check in, always careful and always circling the same question without quite asking it directly, the question being whether Ruth had thought any more about the situation with the farm. She had thought about it. She thought about it every morning when she walked the hollow and every evening when she did her books at the kitchen desk. What she thought was that she had not come this far to stop. The years from 1978 to 1981 were the years that Ruth Garrett would later describe, in the rare moments when she described anything about this period to anyone, as the quiet years. This was not a description of ease. The farm was never easy. Weather was never reliable, markets were never generous, and the physical work of running 280 acres without a partner was the kind of sustained effort that leaves marks on a body that don't go away. She was in her late 30s by then, and she knew her body in the way that people who work hard outdoors know their bodies, as a complicated instrument that must be maintained carefully, or it will fail you at the worst possible moment. What she meant by quiet was that nothing dramatic was happening. The hollow was changing, but slowly and without announcement. The main farm was producing adequately. The debt was reducing at a steady rate. The goose operation was generating a small but reliable supplemental income from eggs and down, and the occasional sale of breeding stock to farms in neighboring counties who had heard, through the particular grapevine that connects farm people across county lines, that the Garrett geese were exceptionally healthy. By 1980, 22 acres of the hollow's eastern and northern sections were productive enough that Ruth planted them. Not with corn, not yet. She planted them with a mixture of clover and timothy that she let the geese graze, which added another layer of biological activity to soil that was still building its structure. The yield on those 22 acres was not a cash crop yield, but it was feeding a larger flock of geese, which were producing more output, which was improving more ground. The system was compounding the way good systems compound, slowly and without drama, each increment building on the last. The Main Street diner had largely stopped talking about Ruth Garrett's geese by this point. The story had run its natural course, the way small-town stories do when they fail to arrive at the satisfying conclusion that everyone expected. Dale Prout had moved on to other topics. The general consensus, to the extent that there was one, was that the Garrett widow was managing somehow, which was what people said when they were not sure exactly how someone was doing but did not have evidence of disaster. Clint Bowman had stopped sending Jimmy Cress up the road, which Ruth noted without drawing conclusions from. Powerful men in their 60s have many things to watch. She did not assume his attention had turned away permanently. She assumed it had turned toward something more pressing, temporarily, and that it would return. She was right about that, but the form it took when it returned was not what she had anticipated. The agricultural crisis that broke across the American Midwest in the early 1980s did not arrive suddenly. It built the way storms build on the Ohio flatlands, visible from a long way off to anyone who was watching the right things, which most people were not. Interest rates had been climbing since the late 1970s as the Federal Reserve fought inflation with the only tool available to it, which was making money expensive. Farm operators who had borrowed heavily in the previous decade to expand their acreage or update their equipment, borrowing at the relatively low rates of the 1970s, and on the basis of land values and commodity prices that those rates had helped inflate, now found themselves holding mortgages that the changed economics of the early 1980s made nearly impossible to service. The numbers were not complicated. An operator who had borrowed at 7% to buy ground at $800 an acre found himself in 1983 paying 18% on debt secured by land whose market value had dropped to $400 an acre, while the price of the corn he was growing had declined substantially from the prices that had seemed to justify the original investment. The math of this did not work. For a great many farms across Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, the math stopped working all at once, and there was no way to make it work again. Ray Garrett had expanded. Ruth had not known the full extent of it until the spring of 1982, when Ray called and his voice had a quality in it that she had never heard before, a kind of pressed-down heaviness that sounded like a man speaking through something he was trying not to let show. He had purchased 80 additional acres in 1978 on a variable-rate loan. He had bought a second tractor the following year. He had been counting on corn prices to stay where they had been, and the interest rate to stay where it had been, and neither thing had happened. He was not calling to ask about the farm sale. He was calling, eventually, after 20 minutes of conversation about other things, to ask whether Ruth might be in a position to help him with a short-term cash situation. Ruth listened to everything he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him to tell her the full number, the complete picture, what he owed and what he could sell and what the gap was. Ray told her. The gap was not one she could fill, not without putting her own operation at risk, and she told him so directly and without apology, because being unclear about money in a crisis is a form of cruelty that she had no intention of practicing. She told him what she could do, which was less than what he needed, and she told him that if it came to it she would talk to the bank on his behalf, which was the offer of a person who understands that sometimes the most useful thing you can offer someone in trouble is your credibility. Ray lost the 80 acres in 1983. He sold them to the bank under duress at a price that covered most but not all of his exposure, and he absorbed the rest through the difficult, grinding process of liquidating equipment and pulling back to the scale he could actually manage. He did not go bankrupt. He came close enough to understand what it felt like to stand at that edge. the farms around Ruth were not all as lucky as Ray. The Pratt family, 3 miles south, lost everything in the fall of 1983. 320 acres, equipment, buildings, gone to the bank and then to auction. The Hendersons to the east held on through 1984 and then gave up. Several others that Ruth had known her whole life in Hardin County went through the same process at different speeds, the same convergence of debt and interest and market collapse producing the same result, which was the bank taking the land and the family driving away with what could fit in a truck. Dale Prout was watching all of this from the Main Street diner, as was his custom, and his commentary on it was the commentary of a man who had survived by being cautious and not speculative, which gave him a perspective that was not entirely without merit, but was delivered with somewhat more satisfaction than the moment called for. Ruth was not at the Main Street diner much during these years. She had a farm to run. What she was doing with her money during the crisis years was not widely known, because Ruth did not discuss her finances with anyone except the man at the bank, and even him she told only what was necessary. She had been accumulating cash slowly since 1978, the product of a farm operation that carried no new debt, spent carefully, and benefited from the federal conservation payment that arrived every year with the reliability of a government check, which is to say absolute reliability. By the end of 1984, she had $21,000 in a savings account in Kenton. She also had, by this point, 30 of the Hollow's 42 acres in various stages of productive use. The clay stratum had not been broken. It would never be broken by any force Ruth intended to apply to it. But above it, in the 10 years of biological accumulation, since the geese first walked into that water, a layer of living soil had developed that was among the most biologically active ground in the county. She had tested it herself with a basic soil test kit she'd ordered from a university supply catalog, and she had sent samples to the Ohio State Extension Lab twice, paying the modest fee each time, receiving reports that listed organic matter percentages and nitrogen levels that the technician who processed the second report had flagged with a handwritten note in the margin that said, simply, "Exceptional." She put the lab reports in the biscuit tin with everything else. In the late winter of 1985, the First National Bank of Kenton posted notices of a foreclosure auction for 3 adjacent parcels east and north of the Hollow, 68 acres total from 2 families that had surrendered to the mathematics of the crisis. Ruth knew the ground. She had farmed near it for 11 years. The soil was decent, not remarkable, drainage adequate, nothing exceptional about it except its location, which was directly adjacent to the Hollow's eastern and northern borders, and which, if incorporated into the Garrett operation, would extend the influence of the Hollow's biological recovery zone significantly. She called the bank and asked for the auction details. The auction was on a Thursday morning in March. The Kenton Livestock Hall, same building where she had bought the geese 11 years before, though it had been renovated since and the smell was different now, more disinfectant and less animal, which Ruth found slightly dispiriting for reasons she could not quite articulate. She arrived early and took a seat near the back. There were perhaps 30 people in the room, a mix of farm operators, land speculators, and men from the bank. She recognized most of them. She nodded to the ones she knew. She did not speak to anyone at length. Ray was in the room, sitting near the middle. He had not told her he was coming, and she had not told him she was coming. They made brief eye contact across the rows of folding chairs, and Ruth nodded. Ray nodded back. His face was the face of a man who had recently learned some hard things about the relationship between ambition and arithmetic. The bidding opened at $180 an acre. There was moderate interest in the room. The cautious, depressed interest of men operating in a market that had punished ambition severely enough that nobody wanted to be seen wanting something too much. A man from Columbus came in at 210. Ruth raised her hand. 240. The Columbus man again. Ruth raised her hand. 270. Columbus. Ruth raised her hand. 290. The room was quieter now. People were looking at Ruth. Dale Prout, who was there from curiosity rather than intention, was looking at Ruth. The Columbus man looked at her and made a small calculation and said 310. Ruth raised her hand. 320. She held it there, her hand in the air, and looked at the auctioneer and did not look at the Columbus man. And the Columbus man looked at his bid sheet and looked at Ruth, and then set the sheet on his knee and did not raise his hand again. The gavel came down. 68 acres at $320 per acre, $21,760. Ruth paid it in a cashier's check she had arranged at the bank the previous day. The transaction was complete in 20 minutes. Ray Garrett sat in his folding chair and watched his sister-in-law shake hands with the bank officer and sign the transfer documents and tuck the paperwork into the folder she had brought. He was 63 years old, which meant he had spent 11 years being wrong about something in a way he was only now fully understanding. And what he was understanding was not simply that Ruth had succeeded where he had expected her to fail, but that the woman he had sat across from at a kitchen table in 1974, with a folder of legal papers and the complete confidence of a man who knows what had been operating in that kitchen, with a clarity of purpose and a depth of planning that he had not come close to perceiving. 11 years. She had known what she was doing for 11 years while he had been waiting for her to run out of road. He did not say anything at the auction. He drove home to Toledo that afternoon and sat in his living room for a long time before his wife asked him what was the matter. He said, "I think I need to go back to Hardin County and talk to Ruth." Clint Bowman heard about the auction within 24 hours. This was predictable. Hardin County was not a place where significant land transactions went unnoticed, and an auction at which a farm widow from the northwest part of the county paid cash for 68 acres during the worst agricultural crisis in 50 years was exactly the kind of transaction that moved through the county's information network at the speed of genuine surprise. He called Jimmy Kress. Jimmy Kress had no new information. The Garrett farm looked the same from the road as it had for years. Geese at the hollow, corn on the main ground, a truck parked by the barn, a woman who did not waste words and did not return favors she had not asked for. Bowman hung up and thought for a while. He was 69 years old. He had spent 40 years building what he had in Hardin County through a combination of capital, instinct, and the willingness to move faster than other people when he saw an opportunity. He had survived the current crisis better than most because he had the capital to absorb losses that would have destroyed smaller operators, and because he had been, by the standards of large-scale Ohio agriculture, somewhat more conservative in his debt than his peers. But he was watching a woman across the county who had just paid cash for land during a crisis, and who was doing something on 42 acres of ground that the county had written off as worthless, something that had been going on for 11 years, something that he had been unable to determine the full nature of despite 2 years of sending Jimmy Kress up the road. He did not like not knowing things. He especially did not like not knowing things about land in a county where he believed he knew everything worth knowing about land. He decided to wait. He was patient when patience served him. He would wait and watch, and eventually the Garrett operation would reveal itself fully, the way all operations did eventually, and then he would know what to do. What happened instead in the summer of 1986 was that the Hardin County Agricultural Committee, of which Bowman was a long-standing member, voted to pursue a countywide drainage improvement initiative. The program was framed as an economic recovery measure, a way to bring more acres into productive use in the wake of the crisis, to improve the county's agricultural output, and therefore its tax base, and therefore its capacity to recover. It was not an unreasonable idea on its face. There was genuine economic logic to it. The parcels identified as priority targets for the program included, on a list of 11 properties across the county, the 42 acres known as the Hollow. Tom Ellery, now 50 years old and still Hardin County's chief agricultural engineer, was assigned to lead the technical review. He pulled the old files from the cabinet. He found his 1968 report. He read his own words, land classified as non-recoverable. He thought about that for a moment. Then he called Ruth Garrett to schedule a site visit. Ruth took the call in the kitchen. She listened to Ellery explain the program and the committee's decision and the planned site visit. She was quiet while he spoke, and the quality of her silence was one that Ellery found, without being able to say precisely why, slightly unnerving. When he finished, she said she understood, and she would be available whatever morning was convenient for him. She thanked him, she hung up. Then she went to the desk in the office and took the biscuit tin from the bottom drawer and removed from it, beneath the notebook and the lab reports and the conservation confirmation letter, a manila envelope that she had placed there in March of 1978. She opened the envelope and spread the documents on the desk and read through them with the steady attention of someone reviewing materials they know well. Federal Wetland Conservation Easement. Registered parcel, Garrett Property, West Section, 42 acres, Hardin County, Ohio. Effective date, March 14, 1978. Duration, permanent. Federal authority supersedes local and county jurisdiction for purposes of drainage, construction, or land use alteration. She put the documents back in the envelope. She put the envelope back in the tin. She put the tin in the bottom drawer. She went to the kitchen and started making supper. Tom Ellery came on a Thursday morning in April. He was a careful, professional man, and he came prepared with survey maps and a new assessment framework that the county had adopted since his last visit. He shook Ruth's hand at the door with the slight formality of a man who is representing an institution and feels the weight of that. She offered him coffee, and he accepted. They drove the farm track to the Hollow together in Ruth's truck, Ellery with his clipboard and maps, Ruth with her hands on the wheel. At the wire gate, she stopped the truck and they got out, and Ellery looked at the Hollow and was quiet. He was quiet for a long time. The Hollow was not what his 1968 report had described. That was clear within 30 seconds of standing at the gate. 30 acres of its 42 were visibly active, productive ground. The geese moved across the near sections in the long morning light, unhurried at home. The eastern section, which 8 years ago had been standing water to the wire, was covered in a dense, dark green growth of mixed grasses and legumes that Ellery recognized as the kind of vegetation you find on soil that has been well managed and well fed over a long period. He walked in without speaking. He crouched at the eastern margin the way you crouch when you want to look at soil closely, pressing his fingers in the way Ruth had pressed her fingers 11 years ago, finding the same density, the same structure, except far more developed now, far more substantial. He dug his fingers in deeper and pulled up a handful and looked at it. He looked at it for a while. Then he looked at Ruth, who was standing at the gate watching him with her arms folded and her expression giving away nothing at all. He walked the Hollow for 50 minutes, making notes on his clipboard, pressing his fingers into the soil in different places, testing the drainage in the sections that were still transitional. When he came back to the gate, he was a man who had seen something he was working to fully understand. Ruth said, "I have something to show you." They went back to the farmhouse. She made more coffee. She went to the desk and came back with the manila envelope and set it on the table between them. He picked it up. He read the documents. He read them again. His face did not change expression in any dramatic way, but around his eyes something shifted, the subtle adjustment of a man who has just had the architecture of a situation rearranged without being given any warning. Federal protection, permanent, 1978. 8 years ago, 3 years after she started with the geese, 1 year before the county had any idea something was happening on that piece of ground, she had protected it before anyone had a reason to try to take it from her. Ellery set the documents down. He picked up his coffee cup. He looked out the kitchen window at the hollow in the middle distance. Ruth did not say anything. She let the silence do what silence does when there is nothing useful left to add. Finally, Ellery said, in the tone of a man who is saying something with more meaning behind it than the words themselves carry, "I'll need to report back to the committee." Ruth said, "I understand." He stood up and gathered his papers. At the door he stopped. He turned back, and he said the thing that he had been working up to since he crouched in the eastern margin of a piece of ground that he had written off as non-recoverable 18 years ago. "Mrs. Garrett, what you've done here. I've been doing this job for 22 years. I have never seen anything like this." Ruth looked at him. She said, "Harlan Garrett watched those geese for 20 years before I started. I just finished what he was trying to figure out." Ellery nodded. He put on his hat. He walked to his truck and drove back toward Kenton to write the most unusual report of his professional career. The committee received it 2 weeks later. The language was careful and technical and conclusive. The hollow parcel was not available for the Drainage Improvement Program due to its status under a federal conservation easement registered in 1978. Furthermore, Ellery wrote, the parcel had undergone substantial and unexpected biological recovery through unconventional means and now represented significant agricultural and ecological value. He recommended the parcel be removed from all future county drainage consideration. The vote to remove it was 4-1. Clint Bowman, for the first and only time in Ruth Garrett's experience of him, did not vote with the majority. He voted no, and then he drove home, and he sat in the room where he kept his land maps and his survey records and his 40 years of accumulated knowledge about Hardin County agricultural property. And he thought for a long time about a woman who had walked into a livestock auction in a black funeral dress with $74 in an envelope, and had, in the 12 years since, done something to a piece of ground that 3 county engineers and 1 very large operation could not do. Had not done, had not even come close to imagining. He thought about this for a long time. Then he called Jimmy Kress and told him he would not be needing his services with respect to the Garrett property anymore. The quiet years were over. Something else was beginning. The summer after the committee vote was the first summer in 12 years that Ruth Garrett was not managing a threat. There was no bank pressure, no county engineering project aimed at the hollow, no Clint Bowman associate driving slowly past the farm road entrance. The federal easement was permanent. The debt was paid. The land was producing. The geese moved across the hollow the same way they had always moved, with the unhurried authority of creatures that had been somewhere long enough to know it belonged to them. Ruth did not know what to do with the absence of pressure at first. She was not a woman who had sought difficulty, but she had lived inside it for so long that its removal felt strange. The way a sound you have stopped hearing suddenly becomes audible again when it finally goes quiet. She kept waiting for the next thing. She walked the hollow every morning and checked the fence and counted the flock and tested the soil at the margins with her fingers. And when all of it was exactly as it should be, she walked back to the farmhouse and started the day's work, and tried not to make the mistake of thinking that because things were going well, they would continue to go well automatically, because that was the exact mistake that had destroyed every farm around her in the past 5 years. But something was different now, and she knew it even when she could not entirely articulate it. The hollow had crossed a threshold that she had not been certain it would cross when she started. The eastern section was fully productive. The northern section was following. The biological system she had built, or rather the biological system that Harlan Garrett had imagined and that she had finished building, was now self-sustaining in a way that meant the geese were no longer necessary for the ground to keep improving. The geese were welcome. They were part of the place, but the place could maintain itself now without being managed toward it. The soil had its own momentum. This was what Tom Ellery had seen when he crouched at the eastern margin and pulled up a handful of earth. This was what his lab reports, which had started arriving in Ruth's mail in the months after his visit, were measuring and documenting with the careful language of people who are trying to describe something they have not encountered before in quite this form. The organic matter content of the hollow's eastern section was, according to the Ohio State Soil Laboratory, in the 93rd percentile of tested agricultural soils in the state. The nitrogen availability was exceptional. The soil structure was what the report called highly coherent, a phrase that Ruth found quietly satisfying in a way she could not fully explain, as if the soil had achieved something that the word coherent captured more precisely than any agricultural term could. She pinned the lab report to the wall above the desk in the office. She left it there for a week and looked at it every morning, and then took it down and put it in the biscuit tin with everything else. Ray Garrett came back to the farm in the fall of 1987. He had called ahead this time, which he had not always done, and there was something in the call that was different from the previous calls, a quality of deliberateness, of a man who has decided to say a thing he has been not saying for a while and has decided the time has come. He arrived on a Saturday morning in October, driving the same sensible Buick he had driven for years, parking in the yard with the familiar care of a man returning to a place he considers someone else's territory and wants to make clear he understands that. Ruth had coffee ready. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they had sat 13 years ago with his folder of legal papers and her one sentence about 5 years and geese. Outside the window the hollow was visible in the gray October light, the geese moving across the near section in their loose, unhurried patterns, the grass dark green even this late in the season, the whole 42 acres looking nothing at all like the standing water and useless ground that the county had written off 2 decades before Ruth got there. Ray was 65 years old. He had aged in the way that men who have been through a hard decade age, with a settledness that was the product of having survived something and knowing it. He had come through the crisis years diminished in the financial sense and enlarged in the personal sense, which is not the trade most men would choose if given the choice, but which tends to produce something worthwhile in the men it happens to. He was quieter than he had been at 52. He listened more. He told Ruth he had been thinking for a long time about what he wanted to say, and that he was going to say it plainly because he did not know another way that was honest. He said he had been wrong. Not about the money being tight in 1974, which was true, and not about the risk being real, which it was. But he had been wrong about her, about what she was capable of, about what she understood that he had not understood. He had come to tell her that, and to tell her he was sorry for the pressure he had put on her in those early years, the calls that were really asking her when she was going to quit, the legal folder on the kitchen table, all of it. Ruth listened to all of it. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then she got up from the table and went to the office and came back with the small folded piece of paper she had written in 1974. The piece of paper she had written alone on the evening after Ray left with his legal folder, the private note she had written, and signed as a record for herself of what she had agreed to. 5 years, Ray. If I am wrong, I will sign whatever you want. She put it on the table in front of him. She said, 5 years ended in 1979. I forgot to tell you. Ray picked up the piece of paper and read it. He looked at it for a long time. Outside the window, the geese were moving across the hollow. The morning light was thin and cold, and clear the way October light in Ohio gets, that particular quality of autumn clarity that makes everything look a little more itself than it does in other seasons. Ray Garrett set the piece of paper down. He looked at his sister-in-law across the table, and something in his face gave way in the way that faces give way when a person stops managing their expression and lets the thing behind it show. He was a man of 65 who had spent most of his adult life believing that he understood things more clearly than most people around him, and the evidence of the past 13 years, culminating in sitting at this table looking at a folded piece of paper that a woman had written alone and kept in a drawer for 13 years, was the kind of evidence that does not permit that belief to continue intact. He put his elbows on the table and put his face in his hands. Ruth did not say anything. She did not move toward him or away from him. She let him have the moment without managing it for him, because she understood that men of a certain age and a certain temperament need to be allowed their grief without an audience that is working too hard to respond to it. After a while, he took his hands from his face and straightened up and reached for his coffee cup. His eyes were wet. He said, "Thomas would have been proud of you." Ruth looked out the window at the hollow. She said he would have come around eventually. They both understood what that meant, and neither of them said anything more about it, and they finished their coffee and talked about smaller things. And when Ray left that afternoon, he stood by his car for a moment and looked out at the hollow the way people look at things they are trying to properly see for the first time, and then he got in his car and drove back to Toledo. He did not call about the farm sale again, not ever. Cassie Garrett arrived the following spring. She was 21 years old, Ray's daughter, and she had spent 2 years at Ohio State studying agricultural science before deciding that what she wanted was not the study of agriculture but agriculture itself. The actual thing, the ground and the work and the daily negotiation with weather and soil and market that constituted a real farming life, as opposed to the version of it that existed in textbooks. She had told her father she was leaving school, and her father had told her she should talk to Ruth, which was itself a measure of how far Ray had traveled from the man who had sat at that kitchen table with a legal folder in 1974. Cassie was not like Ruth in temperament. Where Ruth was still and observant and spoke in short, complete sentences that meant exactly what they said, Cassie was quick and verbal, and had opinions she shared readily, and argued for with an energy that sometimes moved faster than her evidence. She had Ruth's hands, the same broad, capable hands of the women in that family, but she used them differently, with the slightly impatient urgency of youth, always reaching for the next thing before the current thing was fully finished. Ruth watched Cassie the first week the way she watched everything, carefully and without commentary. She gave her the work that needed doing and watched how she did it, and said nothing about how she did it until Cassie asked a direct question, at which point Ruth answered directly and moved on. She did not give instruction that had not been requested. She had learned from her own father that unsolicited instruction is the fastest way to teach someone not to ask questions. What Ruth saw in Cassie was something that pleased her and something that concerned her. What pleased her was the quality of attention the girl brought to the hollow. She stood at the wire gate the first morning the same way Ruth had stood at it 20 years ago, and she was quiet in a way that was not her usual mode, the silence of someone encountering something that requires a different speed than the one they normally operate at. She walked the sections. She crouched at the soil the way Ellery had crouched. She pressed her fingers in and looked at what they found. She said to Ruth that evening at supper, "This is the most alive ground I've ever put my hands in." Ruth said, "It took 20 years to get there." Cassie looked at her across the table for a moment. Then she nodded, and Ruth thought she understood, though understanding something intellectually and understanding it in your body are different things, and only one of them is useful on a farm. What concerned Ruth about Cassie was the speed. Not the speed of the girl's mind, which was genuinely fast and genuinely capable, but the speed of her appetite, the rate at which she wanted to move. She wanted to expand the goose operation. She wanted to market the soil amendments the Hollow's geese produced. She wanted to bring in university researchers and document the biological recovery system formally and publish the results. She wanted to build a small processing facility for the goose meat, and down that would allow direct sales rather than the intermediary prices Ruth had always accepted. None of these ideas were bad. Several of them were good. But they had the quality that young people's plans often have, the quality of existing in a world where capital and time are more available than they actually are, where the bottleneck of any given moment can be removed by energy and intelligence, where things can happen faster than they actually can. Ruth let Cassie talk. She was a patient audience for ideas, which was different from being an automatic supporter of them. She asked questions that she knew would slow Cassie down, not to discourage her, but to help her find the load-bearing elements of what she was proposing, the parts that would hold weight and the parts that looked solid but would not. The argument that mattered came in 1990, in the second year of Cassie's time at the farm. Cassie had been researching a crossbreeding program between the farm's Toulouse geese and a heavier Emden line she had read about in a poultry science journal. The theory was sound, and Cassie laid it out with the confidence of someone who has done her homework, which she had. The projected yield in down and meat weight per bird was meaningfully better than the current operation. The capital required to acquire the breeding stock was modest by the standards of the improvement it would generate. Ruth said she did not want to change the genetics of the flock. Cassie argued. Ruth listened and then restated her position in different words, and Cassie argued again, and Ruth listened again, and the conversation ended without resolution, which in Ruth's household meant the matter was settled, because Ruth did not reopen settled matters. But Cassie had her own resources. She had savings from 2 years of working before she came to the farm, not a lot but enough, and she had a 2-acre section of the hollow's northern edge that Ruth had assigned her to manage as her own responsibility. She proposed to Ruth that she run the Emden cross experiment on those 2 acres with her own money and her own birds, as a separate operation within the farm, and that Ruth would have full access to the results. Ruth was quiet for long enough that Cassie thought she was about to say no. Then Ruth said, 2 acres, your money, your risk. Cassie nodded. Ruth said, if you're going to do it right. Document everything from the start. I want numbers, not impressions. Cassie documented everything from the start. The experiment ran for 3 growing seasons. In 1993, Cassie showed Ruth the results, a 62% improvement in down yield per bird and a 41% improvement in dressed weight, with no observable negative impact on the birds' foraging behavior or their contribution to soil amendment. The numbers were not impressions. They were precise and reproducible, and they were good. Ruth looked at the figures for a long time. Then she looked up at Cassie. She said, "You were right, I was wrong." Cassie had been preparing arguments for a conversation that was going to be harder than this one. The directness of it stopped her. She said, "Just like that." Ruth said, "The numbers are the numbers. What would I argue with?" They converted the whole flock to the M-Den Cross program over the following 2 seasons. The income from down and meat increased by the margins Cassie's figures had projected, which added a meaningful supplement to the farm's operating revenue that Ruth used to continue paying down the last of the original debt, and to build the reserve account that she had always believed a farm needed to survive the unexpected, because the unexpected was not a possibility in farming but a certainty, and the only question was whether you were prepared for it or not. Ruth went to the office desk that evening after Cassie had gone to the farmhouse she was renting on the north section. She took the biscuit tin from the bottom drawer. She opened it and set Harlan's notebook on the desk and turned to the last page, the page with the final entry and the small penciled line about year 3, the page that had been full when she found it and had remained full for the 20 years since she found it. She picked up a pen. She turned to the inside back cover of the notebook, where there was a small blank space between the last page and the cover board. She wrote in a hand that was different from Harlan's but carried something of the same character, the same quality of a person who is putting down a thing they mean. Cassie was right, I was wrong. That is what learning looks like when you are honest about it. R.G., 1993. She closed the notebook. She put it back in the tin. She put the tin back in the drawer. Outside the office window the hollow was dark in the October evening, just the shapes of things visible, the tree line at the north edge, the fence wire catching the last light, the faint movement of geese settling for the night in the grass at the eastern margin. 42 acres that the county had classified as non-recoverable. 42 acres of what was now the most productive and most valuable ground on a farm that had grown from 280 acres to 390. That was debt-free and solvent and building reserves. That was being studied by researchers from 2 universities and had been written about in 3 agricultural journals, though always with Ruth's insistence that Harlan Garrett's notebook be cited as the original source of observation. She sat at the desk in the quiet for a while. Then she turned off the lamp and went to bed. Clint Bowman came in the spring of 1996. He called ahead, which surprised Ruth, because Bowman was not a man who had ever in her experience felt the need to announce himself. When she heard his voice on the telephone, she understood immediately that this was a different kind of visit from the ones he had made before, that something had changed in him or in his calculation of the situation, and that whatever he had to say, he had decided to say directly rather than through intermediaries or offers made at the farm gate. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, 22 years after the Tuesday morning, when he had driven up in his black Cadillac to offer to clear the debt if she would sign away the hollow. He was in a different car now, a practical sedan rather than the Cadillac, and he was 80 years old rather than 58, and those years were visible in the way he moved, and the way he carried himself, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned not to move faster than his body can reliably go. But his eyes were the same, the eyes of a man who has spent a lifetime paying attention to land, who has looked at more ground in more conditions than most people look at in 10 lifetimes, who knows what he is seeing when he sees it. Ruth met him at the door and brought him through the house to the back porch, which faced west toward the hollow. She did this deliberately, the way she did most things deliberately, because she wanted the first thing he saw when he came through the house to be the hollow, and she wanted to be watching his face when he saw it. She watched his face when he saw it. He stood at the porch railing and looked at it for a long time without speaking. The morning light was coming over the tree line from the east, and it fell across the hollow in a way that showed its character clearly, the variation in the vegetation, the sections of different density and different green, the geese moving through it all with the ease of creatures in their proper element. All 42 acres visible from where he stood, all of it alive, all of it productive in the deep biological sense that goes beyond what you can measure in a single season's yield. Bowman put both hands on the porch railing and leaned on it slightly and looked. Ruth stood beside him and said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence is a more accurate instrument than words in most situations, and this was one of those situations. Finally, Bowman said, without looking away from the hollow, "I spent 40 years believing that land had to be beaten into shape. You spent 20 years proving that I was wrong about that." Ruth said, "I didn't prove you wrong, Mr. Bowman. I just had a different problem to solve." He turned and looked at her then, and there was something in the look of an old man who has heard a thing said gracefully that he would have said ungracefully and knows the difference. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and brought out an envelope and set it on the porch railing between them. He said it was an offer, complete purchase of the Garrett operation, all 390 acres including the hollow, at a price he had appraised by 3 independent firms and which he believed was fair and probably generous given current market conditions. He named the figure, $2,400,000. Ruth looked at the envelope. She did not pick it up. She looked at it the way you look at a thing that represents something larger than itself, as if she were seeing not the envelope but all the years that had made the number inside it possible, the $74 at the livestock auction, the 87 dead geese, the cold mornings at the wire fence, the 6 hours at the library in Kenton, the drive to Columbus in November and back in the dark, Ray's face at the kitchen table, Ellery crouching at the eastern margin with a handful of dark soil, Cassie's numbers in the column of a spiral notebook, and underneath all of it, beneath all the years and all the decisions, the cramped handwriting of a man she had never met who had stood at the edge of a piece of water for 20 years and believed that something was there worth understanding. She picked up the envelope. She held it for a moment. Then she set it back down on the railing and pushed it gently back toward Bowman. She said, "This land is not for sale, Mr. Bowman. It never was." Bowman looked at her for a moment. He was a man who had heard no before, but not many times, and not often about things he had decided he wanted. He reached out and picked up the envelope and put it back in his coat pocket. And in his face, in the particular stillness of it, Ruth saw something she had not expected to see, something that was not defeat in the ordinary sense, but was the expression of a man who has arrived at the end of a long argument with himself and found that the other position was correct. He said, "I know." He said it the way a man says something he has known for a while and has finally decided to say out loud, not bitterly, not with the grace of a man performing graciousness, but with the flat, honest acknowledgement of someone who has looked at the evidence long enough and reached the conclusion the evidence supports. He picked up his hat from the porch railing where he had set it and put it on. He shook Ruth's hand, and his hand was the hand of a man who had worked land his whole life, which is to say it was large and hard, and told its own story without needing to say anything. He walked through the house and out the front door, and Ruth heard his car start and heard it go down the farm road, and heard it turn onto the county road, and then heard nothing. She stood on the porch and looked at the hollow. 2 years later, in the spring of 1998, the Ohio State Department of Agriculture invited Ruth Garrett to deliver a presentation at the annual Agricultural Progress Conference in Columbus. The invitation came through Tom Ellery, who had by that time taken an advisory role with the department, and who had spent the intervening years since his visit to the Hollow in 1986 describing what he had seen there to anyone in the agricultural research community who would listen, which turned out to be quite a few people. The conference was held in a large meeting hall at the state fairgrounds in Columbus. There were several hundred people in the room: agricultural researchers, extension officers, farm operators, department staff, a few journalists who covered the agricultural beat for regional papers. It was a professional audience, experienced and not easily impressed, the kind of room that attends these events because they are useful rather than because they are expected to be remarkable. Ruth was not a public speaker. She had not spent her life cultivating the ability to hold a room. She was a woman who expressed herself most naturally through work and through action, and through the quality of her attention, and none of those things translated automatically into a conference presentation. She stood at the podium in a blue dress that was the same shade of blue as the winter sky over the hollow on a clear January morning, a coincidence that she was not aware of but that Cassie, who was sitting in the third row, noticed and did not mention. She had a few notes on index cards that she had written and rewritten in the 2 weeks before the conference, each version shorter than the last, because the more she tried to put into the presentation the less it said, and she kept stripping it back until what remained was almost nothing, just the shape of a thing. She set the index cards on the podium and did not look at them. She reached into the bag she had brought with her and set the biscuit tin on the podium beside the microphone. It was the same tin, rust at the seams, the lid slightly warped from 24 years of being opened and closed and carried and set down in barns and offices and library reading rooms. She opened it and took out the notebook and set the tin aside. She looked out at the room. She said that she wanted to start with something someone else had written, and she opened the notebook to the last page and read, in the flat, unhurried voice of a person reading something they know by heart but are choosing to read from the page anyway, as a form of respect for the person who wrote it. "The geese know something about this ground that I do not. I will keep watching." She closed the notebook. She set it on the podium beside the tin. She said that Heartland Garrett had written that in 1961, on the last page of a notebook he had been keeping since 1941. 20 years of watching the same 42 acres of water and mud and wild geese, watching and recording and not understanding but not stopping. Heartland Garrett died in 1962 and never got his answer. She said she had found the notebook in 1969 when she came to the farm as a bride, and she had read it and put it away and thought about it for 5 years. And in the spring of 1974, she had bought 280 Toulouse geese and 40 runner ducks for $74 at the Hardin County livestock auction, and walked them down a farm track to the piece of ground that the county had tried to drain 3 times and failed 3 times and finally classified as non-recoverable. She said she had done this because a dead man she had never met had watched geese for 20 years, and believed there was something worth understanding about what they were doing to a piece of ground that everyone else had decided was a problem to be solved rather than a place to be listened to. She did not try to make the next part dramatic. She said that the first year she lost 87 birds to a wetland parasite, and people in the county thought she was going to fail. She said she drove 40 miles to the library and spent 6 hours in the reference section, and found the answer in a 1958 extension bulletin from Purdue. She said that by year 3, the eastern margin of the ground was changing in ways that she had hoped for but had not been certain of. She said that by 1986, the county tried to drain it and could not because she had registered it as a federal conservation easement in 1978, 3 years after she started, before anyone had a reason to take it from her. She said that by the time she was standing at that podium, the 42 acres that had been classified as non-recoverable had the highest documented organic matter content of any tested agricultural parcel in Hardin County, and the most productive yield per acre of any ground on her farm. She picked up the notebook and held it for a moment. Then she said the thing she had been working toward, the thing that the index cards had been trying to say in various longer versions, until she stripped them all away and found it. The land does not owe you anything. It does not get easier because you need it to. It moves at its own speed and in its own time, and your job, if you want to understand it, is to be patient enough and humble enough and persistent enough to stay in the conversation long enough for it to answer you. Harlan Garrett started that conversation. I just stayed long enough to hear the end of it. She set the notebook down. She picked up the biscuit tin and put the notebook back inside it and closed the lid and put the tin in the bag and stepped back from the podium. Tom Ellery was sitting in the fourth row. He was 58 years old and had spent 30 years as a county and state agricultural engineer, and he had written his share of reports about difficult land and the engineering challenges of Ohio agriculture. He had written one report that had been bothering him for 30 years, the report that said non-recoverable and terminated efforts. And now, he was sitting in a conference room in Columbus, listening to the woman who had done what 30 years of county engineering could not do explain how she did it. And the explanation was patience, and a dead man's notebook, and $74 worth of geese. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. He was the first person in the room to start clapping. The rest of the room followed, the way rooms follow when someone starts with enough conviction that the gesture is clearly not performance. And after a moment, it was the kind of sound that a large room makes when people have heard something true in a place where they expected only to hear something useful. Cassie was in the third row with both hands raised, her eyes bright, not performing anything, just genuinely moved by something she had been watching from close range for 10 years, and was seeing for the first time from a distance that let her see all of it at once. Ruth stood at the podium and let the room do what it was doing, and did not know what expression was on her face, because she was not thinking about her face. She was thinking about a Tuesday morning in April of 1974, when she walked 280 geese down a muddy farm track to the edge of a piece of water that everyone had decided was a failure. And she was thinking about a man she had never met who had stood at that same edge in 1961, and written down the last thing he understood about what he was seeing, which was that he did not understand it yet, but he would keep watching. She had kept watching for him, that was all. The years after the conference moved with the particular quality that the years of a well-made thing move, not dramatically, not with the constant pressure of threat and uncertainty that the earlier years had carried, but with the steady, accumulating weight of something that is working the way it is supposed to work and knows it. Ruth turned 60 in 2000. And she marked the occasion by walking the hollow in the morning the way she walked it every morning, by herself, at the same pace, pressing her fingers into the soil at the eastern margin, and finding what she always found there, which was ground that was more alive than when she had come to it. Earl Doss died in the spring of 2001. He was 97 years old and had lived on the same property his whole adult life, and had watched 2 generations of Garrett farming from his fence line to the north. Ruth went to the funeral, which was small, the way funerals for very old people tend to be when they have outlived most of the people who knew them longest. She sat in the third pew and listened to a minister say the things ministers say, and thought about Earl at his fence line with his thermos, morning after morning for 30 years, watching her walk the hollow. A week after the funeral, the executor of Earl's small estate sent her a letter with an envelope, enclosed that Earl had left with his will under the instruction that it be delivered to Ruth Garrett after his death. She sat at the kitchen table and opened it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper, handwriting she recognized as Earl's, the cramped and deliberate handwriting of a man who had not written much in his life and took each word seriously when he did. Earl had not begun keeping his written notes about the Hollow until 1948, 7 years after Harlan Garrett started his own notebook. But he had been watching it from his fence line since he moved to the property in 1946, 5 years after Harlan began his observations, and his notes ran from 1948 to the year he stopped being able to write clearly, sometime in the middle 1990s. Nearly 50 years of his own record, sitting in a drawer on the north property, parallel to and unknown beside the 50 years of Harlan's notebook sitting in a biscuit tin on the south property. Two men watching the same piece of ground from opposite fence lines, writing down what they saw, never once comparing notes because neither of them knew the other was doing it. Earl had never known until now, reading Ruth's conference remarks in the newspaper account someone had sent him, that Harlan had been keeping a record of the same thing at the same time. He had never told Ruth, not in 30 years of standing at the same fence line, not in all the mornings with the thermos and the quiet nod, because he had not been sure what he was watching, and he had not wanted to say something that might turn out to be wrong. The old farmer's caution, the preference for observation over announcement. His note to Ruth was short. It said, "I saw what you did. I watched from the beginning. Your father-in-law was watching before you, and I was watching alongside him without knowing it. 3 people watching the same ground across 3 generations, none of us knowing about the others until you put it all together. Some ground takes that long and that many pairs of eyes to figure out. You were the one who figured it out. I always thought you would." Ruth sat at the kitchen table with Earl's note for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the hollow was visible in the spring morning, the geese moving across the near section, the eastern margin a deep and living green, 42 acres of ground that 3 people across 3 generations had watched and believed in before the believing paid off. She folded Earl's note and went to the office and took the biscuit tin from the bottom drawer. She opened it and looked at what was inside. Harlan's notebook, the federal easement letter, the lab reports, the piece of paper she had written in 1974 about 5 years and whatever you want, the note she had written in 1993 about Cassie being right. She put Earl's letter in the tin. She put the lid on. She sat for a moment with the tin in her hands. Then she put it back in the bottom drawer, because that was where it belonged, and went to start the day's work. Cassie Garrett formally took over management of the farm in 2003. Ruth was 63 and healthy, and had no intention of stopping work, but she had been moving toward this handoff for 5 years in the gradual, undramatic way that she moved toward things, transferring responsibility and decision-making in increments small enough that the line between managing the transition and simply doing what she had always done was not clearly visible from the outside. By the time Cassie put her name on the operating documents, the transfer was already complete in every practical sense. The farm was 390 acres, debt-free, carrying a reserve account that represented 4 years of operating expenses, which was Ruth's definition of the minimum acceptable financial security for an agricultural operation that would face the unexpected, because all agricultural operations face the unexpected. The goose operation, now fully converted to the Emden cross genetics that Cassie had proven out a decade earlier, was generating supplemental income that had become a meaningful part of the farm's financial base, rather than the marginal addition it had once been. The hollow was, according to the most recent independent appraisal, valued at $4,200 an acre. $176,400 for a piece of ground that had been offered at $1,200 total in the spring of 1974, that had been classified as non-recoverable by the county in 1968, that no bank would have accepted as collateral in the year Ruth began working it, that every person in Hardin County who held an opinion about it had held a wrong opinion about it for as long as anyone could remember. It was the most valuable ground on the farm per acre, by a significant margin. The day Cassie signed the operating documents, Ruth walked the hollow one more time in the afternoon, the way she had walked it 10,000 times over 29 years, at the same pace, in the same direction, pressing her fingers into the soil at the eastern margin. The soil was what it had become, dense and dark and coherent, full of the biological life that 3 decades of patient management had built into it, one invisible increment at a time. She walked the full perimeter. It took 40 minutes. The geese moved around her without alarm, accustomed to her presence in the way animals become accustomed to the presence of a person who has been there long enough to be considered part of the landscape. At the northwestern corner, where the fence turned south toward the farm road, she stopped and looked back across the full 42 acres in the afternoon light. All of it visible from this point, the whole thing, the variation in the vegetation that marked the stages of its long recovery, the geese spread across it in their loose formations, the water that still stood at the far western center, permanent and necessary, the wet heart of a living system that had been dead when she found it. She stood there for a while without moving. Then she turned and walked back up the farm track to the house. Inside, she went to the office and took the biscuit tin from the bottom drawer one more time. She opened it and took out Harlan Garrett's notebook and opened it to the inside back cover where she had written in 1993. She read what she had written. Cassie was right. I was wrong. That is what learning looks like when you are honest about it. She picked up a pen. Below that, in the same hand, she wrote, "The ground is in good hands. It took 3 of us watching and 1 of us finishing, and now it passes to the next one. The land does not forget what it has been given. Neither should we." R.G. 2003. She closed the notebook. She put it back in the tin. She put the tin back in the bottom drawer of the desk. She left it for Cassie to find.